If you're wondering what the best compositions were for patch 10.10, I just updated my meta snapshot, so I highly recommend you guys check this out. I'm going to be going over the top 5 comps today, and I'm going to be going into a little more detail now. It's the second week of the patch, so I really want you guys to know how to play each of the best comps instead of just knowing what the tier list of everything is. So let's just hop right into it. If you're new to the channel and you want to get better at teamfight tactics, you'll definitely want to hit the subscribe button down below, turn on notifications, and if you like this video, go ahead and hit the like button as well. But without further ado, let's get into the top 5 compositions for this patch. Not too many changes compared to week 1. Most of these comps that were strong before are still strong. We have Shredder and Kale and friends in S tier. Next up in A tier, we have Void Brawlers, but there's a slight difference on how to play them. Mecha Infiltrator still good, and then Blaster, Brawler, and Rebels. They're kind of like the same thing. They both use Jinx Carry, and you just kind of play whatever you hit. I'm going to be going over how to play the basics of each of these comps. So first up, we have the Shredder build. On this build, we want to hyper roll this composition at stage 3-1 or slow roll it at level 5 at 50 gold during stage 3. The whole point of this build is you need level 3 Xayah, and she just carries through every single game pretty much, and you could just go to level 9 really quickly and then add in a bunch of the strong legendary champions as your win condition. While you're hyper rolling or slow rolling, again, both approaches work pretty well. You can go for Jarvan and Fiora as well, and Caitlyn, though these 3 champions are not that important. Fiora can be replaced with Aurelia if you don't get her to 3-star, and Caitlyn can be replaced with any other chrono unit. Jarvan's pretty important because getting him to 3-star allows you to get a lot more attack speed on your Xayah. A sample build in the early game at level 5, since that's the level you'll primarily be at, would be something like this, with Caitlyn, Xayah, Fiora, Jarvan, and Shen. The most important items are Xayah items. I would not go for this build unless you have a lot of Xayahs early, such as maybe 4 before you start hyper rolling or slow rolling, and you need at least 2 gloves. Last Whisper, I think, is one of the stronger items on her, but if you can't get that, there are a lot of different alternatives. Infinity Edge is one of the best ones. Deathblade is another good one. Runons is pretty good as well if you have a Deathblade. And then some people like having a defensive item. Some people like having triple offensive items. They both work. It really just depends on what you hit. If there are a lot of Bramble Vests in your lobby, Last Whisper is definitely something you want to go for. But if there isn't, you could go like double Infinity Edge. You could go Deathblade. All these options are really, really good. After that, you'll want to itemize Jarvan. Jarvan, he uses Hat really well because it gives even more attack speed to your Xayah. But all other defensive items work really well on anyone in your front line. Examples of this are maybe something like a Bramble Vest yourself. Locket of the Iron Solari is pretty good. You could add in a Redemption. I really like this item because it gives mana and tankiness for your whole team. Frozen Heart's really good when stacked, so if you ever get like 2 Frozen Hearts, that's always going to be really strong. ZZ Rod's good on Jarvan because he gets a 3-star, and you could also put Thieves' Gloves on any of your tanks. If you end up playing Rakan, you could add things such as Morello Namicon or Spear of Shojin on him. Those work pretty well as well. So another thing about this composition is that you have to make sure that you're not too contested. This composition can only support 3 players, which is a lot, but you really don't want to be that 3rd player going for this comp. It works much better if there are only 2 people going for it. So if there are 3 people going for it, make sure you have maybe 5 or 6 Xayahs going into stage 3-1. If not, I'd likely pivot to a different composition. Other compositions that can use these Xayah items are something like Jhin, Jinx, or Aurelia compositions. Again, the most important thing to know is that the only 3-star that matters is Xayah. Everything else is secondary. So once you get Xayah 3-star, you want to change your strategy to try to level up as quickly as possible instead of keep rolling to finish Jarvan, Fiora, and Caitlyn. One thing to note, I typically don't go for Shen 3. Some people do it, but that's only if you're on like Reroll Galaxy or if you get a lot of Shens. If not, he's good to hit, but sometimes he's too expensive. I'd rather go level 9 with the extra gold instead of trying to hit Shen 3. What I like about this composition is that it's pretty easy to play and it's very, very strong. It also counters a lot of the compositions in the meta right now because a lot of teams use Bramble Vests and people use Vanguards in the early game often. Another thing it's good at is win streaking during the mid game, so you could get a lot of gold in order to get the strongest late game. Next up, we have a Kale build. There's so many different variations for this build. I'll try to get into most of the popular ones here. This one's the classic one. It's the 4 Chrono with Kale, and you also have Mana Reaver mixed in as well. All you have to do is remember to pick up Xayah because she's a Celestial Blade Master, and Celestial is pretty important for this composition since Kale is going to heal a lot in the late game with the Rage Blade stacks and the Chrono stacks. I think the best items on Kale is Rapid Fire Cannon, and Rage Blade. The third item, you could be any defensive items. They all work in different scenarios. For example, if there are a lot of Khazixes or Infiltrator players, you definitely want a Guardian Angel on Kale. If there aren't, you could play something like Quicksilver Sash or Trap Claw. Those work really well. If you get red buff, you could go ahead and play Blasters like we see here. We have Ezreal and Misfortune, but if not, you don't really need Blaster or red buff. It's just something good early game because this is a really good comp to transition into from a Cybernetic start or a Blaster start. One thing you could do is play 4 Brawlers, and all you have to do is take out Ezreal, add in Blitzcrank instead, and all you have to do is add in a Malphite and a Vi. When you do this, you need to take out certain units. So what I like to do sometimes is drop down to 2 Chrono. So what you can do is drop Thresh and Wukong. Obviously, Thresh and Wukong are better units than Blitzcrank and Malphite, but this is a very solid early game start that can help you snowball into the late game. I forgot Cho'Gath. Let's add him here. So in the mid game, before you hit Misfortune, this is a very strong 8-man composition. In terms of flexible units, the only 3 units you really need in this build are Kale, Shen, and Kassadin. Shen's good because he's both Chrono and Blade Master. Kassadin's very good because you always want Celestial buff, and he's one of the best Celestial units. And also Mana Reaver is very easily accessible through either Thresh or Aurelia, and it's also a really strong buff in the late game. And lastly, of course, you need Kale because she is the composition we're building around. You'll want Valkyrie, so MF is really good, but you could use Kai'Sa until you get Misfortune. So what you can do is if you get a lot of Misfortune items, you can go ahead and just place them on Kai'Sa. And once you get Misfortune, just go ahead and sell Kai'Sa and move the items over onto Misfortune. Other variations of this build is going a 6 Blade Master route, so we could go ahead and do that here. If we go to class, we can add in Aurelia and we get Mana Reaver, Xayah, we get Celestial, and then you just add in any 2 other Blade Masters. For example, you could do Master Yi and Yasuo, since Fiora is by far the worst one. The positioning for this composition could look something like this, with Shen in the front and the other units in the front line as well. One thing to keep in mind, whenever you run Mana Reavers, you want to keep them separate from each other. So you could have Aurelia on one side and Kassadin on the other, or Thresh separated as well. And Kassadin is a unit that you have to pay a lot of positioning or attention to for positioning. So a lot of people like putting their carries over here. So pretend you're on the other side. If there's a Kassadin over here, he can go ahead and disarm your enemy carry from this position. For example, if their enemy carry is over there, you could place him over here so that he hits them with his ability. So you always want to put Kassadin on the edges and not necessarily in the center. So say there's a Gangplank in the middle, which you want to Mana Reave. I'd put Aurelia in the center and then Kassadin on a different side. Other high priority targets to Mana Reave are Wukong and Cho'Gath. Those you'll have to scout for because their positioning is variable all over the front line. But for most carries, whenever people put them in the second row or even the third row, you could always counter them with Kassadin in a well-placed position if they don't have the proper defensive items. You can't do this if they have Quicksilver Sash or Trap Claw, but it's still worth getting rid of a Trap Claw with your Kassadin. Quicksilver Sash you can't really do anything about though. The last variation I want to go over is a Mystic build with Lulu Karma. This one's really strong because obviously you get a huge attack speed increase from Karma on your Kale, and Lulu's a very strong unit. She also gives Celestial to your team, so this is a very strong late game build. This is just an 8-person composition, so if you ever get any sort of spatula item, maybe like a Celestial spatula, you can add in another Celestial. You could also add in a lot of units on your bench for Thresh to pull in. All of these tactics work. And again, you're still running Mana Reaver. You might want to separate like this so that Aurelia gets a Gangplank, Thresh gets a side unit here, and Kassadin gets a Disarm and Mana Reave over here. There are a lot of different ways to position this. You could also play Soraka instead of Karma because Kale gets so much attack speed anyways that sometimes the Karma buff is a little too much. One thing to note, you really only need 2 Chrono. I know the first build I showed was a 4 Chrono build, but 2 Chrono is enough. You don't really need the 4 Chrono. So never like pressure yourself into forcing 4 Chrono when you only need 2. 4 is nice, but only really in that other build that we had. If you hit the units for free, go ahead and do it. But again, you want to try to be flexible with this composition and just use whatever you hit. That way you can save more gold to level up to level 9, add in a Thresh, and add in units for Thresh to pull in. The last thing I want to go over is if you manage to get Aurelia items. Aurelia is really strong if she has a cybernetic buff because Cybernetics give bonus attack damage and Aurelia scales off attack damage. So what you can do here is the synergies we're missing right now is Chronos, Celestial, and Cybernetic. So we could add those by adding in a Blitzcrank, we can add in Illusion for Blaster, and then we can add in a Vi. This is a pretty decent build. We can hit this at level 8. So it's another option you could do. This is really good if you have a red buff on Lucian. This way you get Brawler, you get Chrono, and you still have Mana Reaver, but you do buff up your Aurelia if you happen to get a lot of Infinity Edges. It's pretty decent if you want like a secondary carry that's not Misfortune. At level 9 when you do this build, you can add in your Celestial or use Celestial Spatula. Obviously Lulu's the best, but we don't always get that. You could just add literally any one of these. One thing to note is the Shen positioning. Shen's ability creates like a force field that dodges all attacks. So obviously you do want him sandwiched between two of your tanks, but you don't always want him. Intuitively, this makes sense, but it isn't always the case. Sometimes you want him exposed on the side so that he ults faster. So you could do this if he's level 2 or level 3. If he's level 1, I'd probably sandwich him because he's going to die too quickly if you leave him isolated. But if he's level 2, you could leave him on the edge and it's no worries there. It really depends on who you're facing. The last note I want to make about positioning is if you have rapid fire cannon, which should be most games, you could actually backline the Kale to get more range. This positioning would be good if there are not too many infiltrators, because then she isn't vulnerable in the back line, because infiltrators jump to the back and attack her right away. That's why we normally place her here or up here. That's pretty much just to run away from the infiltrators. But if there are no infiltrators and you have rapid fire cannon, go ahead and put her in the back row. Pretty much any spot works. That way you really maximize the bonus from her range. All right, the next composition I want to go over is a Hyperroll Khazix build with Vel'Koz carry. This build is super good right now. There are a lot of Hyperroll builds that work, and right now I'm showing the super late game comp. Let's get rid of Gangplank. Let's get rid of the Demospat. You don't really need that till much later. This is pretty much the core build here. You can reach this at 8 units, and essentially you want to Hyperroll at 3-1 for Khazix, Twisted Fate, and Malphite. You could also slow roll as well. This really comes down to preference and what state you are in during the game. But you only want to go this build if you have Rapid Fire Cannon and Infinity Edge on Khazix. A lot of people like building Zeke's Herald on him as well. You could go ahead and do that. That's also a really strong build. I think the build that works better is the Rapid Fire Cannon and Infinity Edge. He does true damage, so unlike other carries, you don't need something like Last Whisper. And with the Rapid Fire Cannon, he actually gets his isolated damage off a little more often. Go for Malphite and Twisted Fate because they're all very strong one costs that fit into your team eventually. For your tanks, you want to do the 4 Brawlers. This is because we need to play Cho'Gath because he is a void unit, so the most natural tank units to add in after that are the other Brawlers. And we also have a Malphite at 3-star, so we might as well just add in Blitzcrank and Vi. These two are very solid units on their own anyway, so it's kind of like a no-brainer to play them in this composition. Lastly, you'll want to add in Fizz for the Infiltrator buff to really take Khazix to the next level. So what the Infiltrator buff does is at the start of combat, Infiltrators jump to the back line, and they also gain attack speed for 6 seconds at the start of combat. And whenever they get a kill, they keep the attack speed bonus. So obviously, if you have a 3-star Khazix who's itemized, he's going to have this attack speed buff the entire game. So that's why you really want to add in Fizz. Fizz is probably the best Infiltrator to complement this team with because he has a crowd control effect. One thing to note in the early game, as you're rolling down for Khazix, Twisted Fate, and Malphite, you'll want to play a Kai'Sa early for the Infiltrator buff, and you could use Kai'Sa as an item holder for Vel'Koz. So in the early game, your team will look something like this at 5 units, and what you can do is, if you have like a Seraph's Embrace, Morellonomicon, just put that on Kai'Sa, save it for Vel'Koz later, and she's pretty much just your dedicated item holder. Oh, one also helpful tip in the early game is put your Blitzcrank on the opposite side of Khazix. The reason why you want to do this is Blitz is going to hook a target and increase the chance that they'll be isolated for Khazix in order for Khazix to do bonus damage on his ultimate. It's a fun little trick because if you put them on the same side, Blitz is going to hook a target over here and potentially people have someone next to their carry where Khazix jumps. For example, we typically position, if you look at our Kale build from before, we often had Kale over here with Lucian in the back there. So if Khazix jumps over here, he might not get his isolated damage unless Lucian dashes away really quickly. But let's say we had a Xayah there instead. Khazix wouldn't be able to get his isolation damage off on the enemy carry at all. That's why you'd want to play Blitzcrank so he hooks a Xayah and then he'll be able to hit the Kale at that point. This little trick is also useful for Mecha Infiltrator, which we'll get into in a second. So after you hyperroll for Khazix, Malphite and Twisted Fate. You could go for Kai'Sa 3-star if she just appears abundantly, but you don't really want to do it because you want to swap the items over to Vel'Koz. But later in the game, you'll want to rush level 8 after you get your Khazix level 3 and Malphite level 3. And then you'll want to just slow roll for Cho'Gath and Vel'Koz and try to get them 3-star as that's your win condition. You don't need them to do well, but it is very helpful to have much later into the game. I often find myself rarely going to level 9, but if you do happen to get to level 9, add in a Gangplank, and if you have a Demolitionist Spatula, that's going to be very good for your Vel'Koz because he's going to get a lot of value from that with Gangplank. Gangplank's really broken right now, that's why I'm including him in a lot of compositions, but he's really only good if you get a Guardian Angel on him. But if you do happen to get that with the Demolitionist Spatula, it's going to be a really, really good game for you. But yeah, this is a really strong build. It's got a strong early game with the 3-star Kha'Zix, and it's got a good late game if you manage to hit the 3-star Cho'Gath or Vel'Koz. If you get leftover items, just throw them onto Cho'Gath because he's going to be able to pretty much tank everything and deal a decent amount of damage himself. So next up we have Mecha Infiltrator. This is the final late game build. You don't normally reach this, but if you do happen to hit Echo, replace Kha'Zix for Echo. But let's remove these for now. And let's add in the core build, which is reached at 6 units, which is 4 Infiltrator and 3 Mech Pilot. So the way to play this game is, in the very beginning, you'll want to play Blitzcrank and Malphite as your tanks, or Leona and Poppy. I tend to favor the Blitzcrank Malphite version a little better because you could also run Chrono with Caitlyn or Twisted Fate, but both of these work. Ideally, you'll have both Kai'Sa and Kha'Zix as your 2 early game units for damage. And also you could do the Blitzcrank trick, which is another reason why I prefer Blitzcrank over the Vanguards. Because again, you'll want to move Blitzcrank to one side and Kha'Zix on the other. That way he gets isolation damage on the enemy units. The items you want to go for, you want to get armor off the first carousel. That's the most important because Bramble Vest allows you to win streak really early. If you have this on Malphite or Poppy, it's pretty much just an auto win in stage 2. Next up, you'll want to get a Quicksilver Sash or Kai'Sa items. This depends on what items dropped for you before. So the items I would slam early are Demolitionist Charge, Morellonomicon, Bramble Vest, and Quicksilver Sash. Everything else, I'd kind of greed the items to try to get perfect items later in the game. You could check more of this out in my mech guide, which I'll link in a card above. I'll also leave a link in the description if that's easier for you guys. Apart from this, you'll want to build as big of an economy as you can and slow roll this composition at level 6. This typically happens at stage 3-5 where I'll be 50 gold and fresh at level 6. This is right after the stage 3 carousel typically. And then from there, you just roll down your gold to 50 gold every turn until you hit all your units. Once you hit them, you'll sell your early game tanks such as Poppy, Leona, Malphite, and Blitz, and then play your core units as seen here. I like having a tier item on Kai'Sa. I feel like Kai'Sa needs at least one tier item. Seraph's Embrace is good. Spear of Shojin's decent if you have a spare BF Sword. BF Sword is kind of useless in this composition. It really only fits on Shaco, but Shaco's not that good until much later in the game where you either already won or he's kind of like a win more type of champion. So if you do get a sword and a tier, just go ahead and build Spear Shojin on Kai'Sa if you're not able to get Seraph's Embrace. Other items that work on Rumble is, my favorite's Titan's Resolve, but there are actually a lot of different options right now. So the core will always be QSS and Bramble, but you could add in a Trap Claw for more dodge, and Rumble gets a new Trap Claw when the mech dies. So you kind of get double value from this Trap Claw, which is kind of neat. But one of the best late game items is Shroud of Stillness. This, again, gives him more dodge chance, but he also gets to silence important units on the enemy team. So since mechs tend to care about positioning a lot, you get a lot more value out of items such as Shroud of Stillness and Zephyr because you're always going to be looking to position against the enemy team every turn because that's like the core of the composition. It's definitely difficult and stressful to play Mech Infiltrator, but it's very rewarding if you get good positioning. Speaking of positioning, you never want your mech in the middle. You want your mech to be on the side of the enemy team where you're most likely to face, because the mech deals area of effect damage with his auto attack and with his ultimate, so you always want him in front of the enemy team. So if people are more positioned towards the right side, you'll want to move your mech to the right. If they're more towards the left side, you'll want to move them towards the left. And same with your other units in the back. So you could leave your Kai'Sa and Shaco on the sides as well. in order to hit the most units and most important units. One thing you can do is move Khazix to the bottom left, because a lot of people, if they position on the right side, they often leave a bait on the top left, and Khazix will get isolation damage off of them, which could be pretty useful. For example, my Khazix has killed level 2 Misfortunes all the time, just because he's able to get isolation damage off. And trading a Khazix for a Misfortune, I'm always going to do that in my book. So as the game progresses, you'll want to find a time to know when to all in. So if you are on stage 4-1 and you don't have Fizz yet, you'll most likely want to roll to get him if your front line isn't strong. So remember how we had Blitzcrank and Malphite, or Poppy and Leona before? If you don't have Leona, Poppy 2-star, or you don't have Malphite 2-star, you'll definitely want to roll down to try to find Fizz or get them to 2-star. If not, you can greed a little bit till you're around maybe 50 health and until you all in for the Fizz. Later in the game during stage 5, if you're ever below 30 or 20 health, you'll definitely want to roll down to 0 to try to finish all your 3-star units. I forgot if I didn't mention this before, but you want a 3-star Annie, Rumble, Kai'Sa, and Shaco. Shaco's the least important, but if you happen to find him along the way, you might as well pick him up, especially if you have items for him. If you don't have any items for him, say he was naked, you wouldn't want to roll for him at all. Once you find Annie or Kai'Sa level 3, or you get one of them to level 3 and feel like you need to give up on the other, go ahead and add in a sorcerer. My favorite is Lux, and this is the best thing to put in right now at level 7. Some people like putting in Kale, but you don't really need to do it. Valkyrie isn't as important as you think, because Kai'Sa's more of a Morellonomicon user and a Demolitionist user rather than your main damage dealer. Your main damage dealer is actually the Mech. However, if you reach level 8, go ahead and put in Kale or Misfortune. Misfortune's generally the best. If you don't have Demolitionist Spatula, you could put in Gangplank or Ziggs to get Demolitionist back for your Mech, because it's super, super important, and Rumble also makes great use of it once he pops out of the Mech. That's pretty much it for Mech. If you want to get a more in-depth guide, again, I'll be linking it in the description below. The last composition I want to go over is Jinx Carry, so this could be either in Rebels or Blaster Brawler. So when you play Blaster Brawler, you'll want to have a bunch of Giant Slayers. Those are generally the best items. If you're playing Rebels, you'll want Last Whisper, Infinity Edge, because that damage gets buffed by the Rebel buff. But both items work in both builds in a worst case scenario. Sometimes you just don't get the units for the composition that you want. But this is a pretty standard 4 Brawler, 4 Blaster build. This composition is best in the mid game, and you can use this to transition into different compositions, such as you could drop 2 Blasters and add in more Rebels or more Legendaries, because you could add in like Ziggs and Gangplank. If you have Gangplank items, that works really well. Or you could add in pretty much any strong legendary unit and take out 2 of the Blasters, such as Graves and Ezreal. If we want to take a look at the Rebel build, I did a guide on this last week, so I'll leave a link in the description below for this as well. This build is much stronger in the late game than the 4 Blaster, 4 Brawler build, and this is because Rebels make great use of the late game legendaries. The one caveat is that it's hard to reach this stage because you need to get a strong early game, and this composition is played a little differently than how Blaster Brawlers played, because one thing you could do is if you get a lot of Tears and Ziggs, you could go ahead and hyper roll Ziggs on 3-1 and get Ziggs 3 and Malphite 3, and that'll carry you all the way to level 9. If you're not able to get that, it's okay to go Rebels without fed Ziggs. What you can do is just play strong early game boards such as Cybernetics, Blaster Brawler, and then transition into 6 Rebels later in the game with a Jinx Carry. The items you want whenever you go Rebels are actually Gangplank items. He's actually kind of the main carry of Rebels, because Gangplank's just a broken unit right now when he has Guardian Angel, and since you're running Demolitionist already, he's going to be getting Area of Effect stuns, in which case it'll allow Jinx to clean up the fights very easily. You could also go Misfortune Carry if you get a bunch of items for her, because she can solo some fights on her own as well. Most strategies for Jinx compositions revolve around strong early game, so I'm going to link a video to level up as fast as you can to level 8 while also preserving your health. So win streak starts are very good for this. So the leveling pattern would be leveling up to level 4 at stage 2-1 or 2-2, leveling up to level 5 after Carousel at stage 2-5. Then you'll go ahead and go to level 6 at stage 3-2 and level 7 either on 3-5 or 4-1 depending on what your win streak is. And lastly, you'll want to go to level 8 at either 4-3 or 5-1 and then roll down to 0. Find all your units and hope that you hit them and use Jinx Carry to get you to level 9. If you're able to hit all the legendaries on level 8, that's fantastic. You'll probably win the game. But if not, you'll have to find a way to stabilize with Jinx in order to wait for you to get to level 9 in order to hit Gangplank and Misfortune. Yeah, this is a very strong composition late game. And honestly, Jinx comps aren't too contested right now because everyone's going for hyper roll, so this should be pretty free for you to play. All the other 4 cost players, they're going for Kale, so if you're able to hit Jinx for free because it's uncontested, I highly recommend going for it as you'll get great results from that. That's it for me today. If you want more content, go ahead and go to my Discord at bunnymuffins.lol/discord. We're going to be playing in-houses this weekend. We also have a bunch of different coaches there that offer help to newer players. And we also just have a very large growing community where everyone's helping each other out, getting better at teamfight tactics. That's it from me though. I'll see you guys next week for the new patch. I'll be doing a patch review on Tuesday, as well as the new meta comps list on Friday. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to share and subscribe. And of course, smash that like button. Each like is an LP I gain before the next video.